Hi, and welcome to Genre Chat. We're in for a special treat today. One of my favorite types of reading is thriller suspense novels, and we have somebody here with us. You are in for a treat. He's a best-selling author of over 36 books. Most of you writers who are watching this have probably read one of his books. I'm going to let him introduce himself. You're going to love this guy. Stick with us for the next 30 minutes and learn about thriller and suspense writers. Welcome, Stephen James. Welcome to a Genre Chat.
Yes, thank you so much for letting me be here.
Tell us a little bit about your writing career, when you started, how you started.
Well, I actually started to tell stories when I was younger. My uncle would always get the kids together at Thanksgiving, Christmas, and things like that. And he would take us into the corner and he would tell us ghost stories. And so, yeah. So then whenever I got older and I was working at a camp in college, I started to tell my uncle's stories to the kids at night. And eventually I just used up all of his stories and had to make up my own. And I never really thought I would make a career out of telling stories or writing stories. But eventually then I started to write for magazines and then eventually books. And the last decade has been mainly writing thrillers.
I love your thrillers. I haven't read them all, but I've been listening to some of them on audio. And you just take the reader right up to the edge. Now, is there somebody that you like to read that has helped you in your writing process?
Man, some of the people that I like to read are write philosophy, poetry, even spiritual writings and so on. And I've always loved thrillers. But now I try not to read too many thrillers that are too similar to what I write so that my writing won't sort of subconsciously mirror what's out there. But I still do read thrillers whenever I can get a chance. It's just that I have quite a wide range of reading interests.
What is the greatest lesson you've learned while writing thrillers? It can be a writing lesson. It can be a life lesson.
I would say probably has to do with twists, actually. When you write twist, you have to find an area where something can have a double meaning, clearly, so that if somebody says one thing, it could mean something else later on. And writing stories that have double layers of meaning, or even more than two layers, that's been fascinating for me, because each of my stories has at least one big twist, or maybe more twists. And for each of those twists, you need a separate world, I call it, of inevitability, where everything would make sense if that were the case. And then as you build the story up, you continue to twist the threads. That's one of the most fun games for me when writing.
I know. When I'm reading a thriller or watching a thriller, I love the twists. In fact, I like to try to guess what the twist might be. Now, I'm reading. In fact, I'm in your book, Story Trumps Structure.
Yeah.
And in the twist, you say there's 4 elements. Do you know? Can you expound on? You say they're unexpected, inevitable, an escalation of what preceded it, and a revelation. Can you expound on those a little bit for those who, like me, are trying to write suspense novels? And I mean, I can watch a twist, but I don't know how to write it as well.
Sometimes just think in terms of how to pivot the story forward. So if you're playing basketball and you get the ball, you can keep one foot rooted where it was, but turn and throw the ball, or maybe shoot the ball, something like that. When you're writing a twist, I kind of think of it as being rooted in what just happened in the story, but you're trying to turn and pivot in a place where the readers, or if you were playing basketball, the other team doesn't expect you to go. So those first two aspects, unexpected and inevitable, if a story is only one or the other, it won't be satisfying. Like you mentioned, you like to try to guess where a twist might go. Well, readers want to guess where a story will go, but they want to be wrong. It's one of the paradoxes of writing.
Yes.
if you're right, if you guess it halfway through the book, you'll end the book and say, I knew that 200 pages ago. And so it's one of the fascinating things that we try to play this game with readers where we know that they're guessing and they know that they're guessing, but we need to be one step ahead. And so if you have a twist that's just unexpected, it comes out of nowhere. Let's say you're writing an Amish romance and suddenly, right, you know, and so suddenly aliens land and like shoot all the cows and take off into space. Well, clearly that's unexpected, but it's probably not inevitable. On the other hand, let's say that you have something where it seems pretty predictable. Like you think, well, the killer probably just switched the guns so that the cop used the other gun or something. And that's exactly what happened. You wouldn't be happy then either. And so it needs to walk that line where it's something we don't expect, but when it happens, we say, of course, that makes sense. So those are the first two aspects, unexpected, inevitable. The second is it has to be an escalation, or the third is escalation, and that has to do with the fact that stories build in tension. And so this is one of the reasons why dream sequences typically don't work. So you'll start really exciting, story. The guy's on an airplane and someone pulls out a grenade and he runs over, leaps on him, and it blows up. And then the guy woke up. Well, no reader is sitting there saying, oh, amazing, that's such a great twist. They're all saying, oh, come on, because it de-escalates. And so you want the twist, right, to propel the story forward and give you the opportunity for more tension. And then the fourth one that you mentioned is that the story actually it reveals added meaning to the events that occurred earlier. So, for example, one of the most famous twist stories is The Sixth Sense. Probably familiar, with the movie. And so at the end, whenever he discovers that he's a ghost, you flip back through all of the scenes where he was, and you then have an added meaning to them. So in a sense, twist pulls the rug out from under the reader, but it does so in a way that allows the reader to be more satisfied by the direction of the story.
Thank you. That helped me. I'm still going to read it again, though. Where do you get your ideas?
Well, when I'm writing, I don't outline my books, or I don't plot anything out. Instead, I typically ask 4 questions as I'm working on a book. And I've found that over the years, there has never been a plot problem where one of the questions didn't answer what I needed answered. So, do you want me to tell them to you?
Yes, please. I'm getting ready to write them down.
Okay, so it's easy to remember. The first is, what would this character naturally do? And then you always have the character do something that's natural. So in the case of, let's say you're writing about a detective who arrives at a crime scene. Well, he might put on the gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints behind. He would look at the lighting, the exit routes and entrance routes, and the blood spatter. All of these things would be believable. They would be natural. But let's say that he walks up and he spits out a glob of gum on the crime scene. Well, readers would say, no, I don't buy it because he's contaminating the evidence. And so, so no matter what scene you're in, if you ask yourself, what would this character naturally do? It'll give you insight into where the scene should go. Because a character always needs to act believably within the world of who he or she is. And so the second is, how can I make things worse? And stories, again, build on escalation of tension. And so as you write a scene, you ask yourself, well, how could I take things and make them even worse than they are? I remember when I was writing my second novel, I thought, well, what's the worst thing that I could ever think to happen to me? I thought, well, maybe if I was chained to the bottom of a pool and it's filling with water, and I know it's going to go up over my head. So I ran upstairs, said to my wife, I'm going to take a woman, I'm going to chain her to the bottom of a pool, and I'm going to fill it with water and film it while it's happening. It's going to be awesome. And she looks at me, she goes, is this for your book? And I'm thinking, do you really need to ask? So, so then the next book, I thought, well, what's worse than being chained to the bottom of a pool and it fills with water? I thought, well, maybe being buried alive. That would be pretty terrible.
Yeah.
So then the next book, I thought, what's worse than being buried alive? I thought maybe being buried alive with a dead body. That would be pretty terrible. So like I ran upstairs. My wife's like, I don't even want to hear it. Don't even tell me. But we ask ourselves, how can I make things worse? And that'll open up opportunities for the story then to escalate. The third is what we talked about a moment ago, and that is how to add a twist, or how to add something that's believable, but also surprising and satisfying at the same time. And then the fourth is, what promises have I made that I have not yet kept? So we make narrative promises when we write through specificity and magnitude. So if we spend a page writing about a house, readers will expect that the house has some significance to the story. And if later on the house doesn't, they'll think, well, what was the big deal? Why did you spend so much time writing about the house?
Right.
Also through specificity is, if you really draw attention to the fact that the water bottle is 3/4 of the way full that was sitting next to his keyboard, well, readers will think, wonder why that matters. Why does 3/4 of the way full matter? And if it doesn't matter later, they'll think, well, again, it was a broken promise. And so I always look at the magnitude that I have built stuff up, or the specificity, and ask myself if there are implied promises there that readers then will be anticipating that I haven't yet fulfilled.
That is such a good point, Stephen, because I've read books where, like you said, they spend so much time on a certain aspect, and you're waiting and you're reading and you're thinking it has something to do with that. And then you're like, you feel like you're left high and dry. Well, why did you even do that?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Continue.
Well, I was just going to say, I think those are problems with proportionality. When you're writing, very often people who outline will have those problems, but people who write organically are always asking what would naturally happen next. And then instead of building up the story without the context of what just happened and what will happen, we're always looking at the most natural progression of events. So,
as I noticed, I'm a stickler for the facts and the details. And I actually will go, if I'm reading a book, I will go and look to see if the writer did their homework. So you do your homework. And so how much time do you spend researching some of these books? Because I can tell you do your homework right down to, I mean, the minute details. I've noticed that about your writing. That's why I like it.
Thank you very much. I would say, well, it takes me about a year to write a novel. And so with the research and the writing, it's usually about a year. I spend quite a bit of time fact-checking everything that I can possibly. I always go to the location to visit the locations. I spend some time there and try to get really inside information. I interview people in the military, FBI, police officers, detectives, scientists, to make sure that everything that I'm writing is, for people who are in the field, believable. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, they know that it's fiction, but I want them to read it and say, yeah, I buy it. That could happen. That could happen. I think the best compliment I ever had on any of my books was I got an email from a guy who said, I've been a detective for 17 years, and when I read your books, I feel like I'm at a crime scene again. So for me, that was huge, because that's really what I'm shooting for. Someone who would be an expert to be able to say, I buy it. That makes sense. Yeah,
it's so important. I was reading somebody's book, and it was done in, I think it was done in 2001 during the day that 9/11 happened, but they called it 9/11 on that day, and I'm like, no, they never even called it 9/11 that day. They didn't know what it was called that specific day. A character called it 9/11. So that's one thing that, as writers, I mean, that you so well stated to us, is that we have to be specific and detailed. We have to be.
Yeah. You know, it's for me, if I want people to be able to read my books and find out things that they never really knew, but they thought they knew. So in a lot of my books, I like to do something where most people think they already know the full story about it, whatever that might be. It's the Jonestown Massacre I did in one of the books, Shark Research I did in one of the books, the Decameron, which is this old story that was written that Canterbury Tales is based on. So in any case, I like to take these things that people have heard of, or say, oh, I know all about that, and then to show layers and layers where I had no idea. And then they look it up and they realize there's a story behind the story. That's always fun for me.
That's what I like about your books too, because you learn a little bit, things that I didn't know about. I wanted to ask you, what advice, I mean, you've given us a lot of advice, but what advice would you like to give writers in this genre? Like advice that you didn't have at the beginning?
Huh. And I think this probably applies to different genres as well. And that is to not fall in love with your first draft. Now, I don't, I don't know how to write a romance novel. There are romance threads, story threads in the books that I write, and I haven't written a science fiction novel and so on. But for the different genres that I have written, fantasy, crime, mystery, suspense, thrillers, I know how important it is to really look at your work and revise and look at the context and allow that to really form the story instead of slapping it down. And I have the sense that a lot of people today, because of the ease of self-publishing through e-publishers and e-books and so on, publish their books before they're ready. It isn't that they're bad books. It's just that they haven't been edited well enough yet. And so I find that often with books that I've picked up or read, people have suggested. So I would say, in some of my books, I've edited scenes dozens of times, and I think it's really vital in order to get to the core of the story.
That is great advice. I mean, I go back and read, I leave stuff for like 2 or 3 days and go back and read it and think, wow, that's horrible. I thought it was good when I read it.
I know.
In storytelling, your book, Story Trumps Structure. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference between story and structure?
I think a lot of people, when they think of structure, they think of 3 acts. So they would say a story has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I still remember when I was in high school, my English teacher said, a story is something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I remember sitting there, 16, 15 years old, saying, so does a description of a chair. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I mean, how does that make it a story? Or the sentence, preheat the oven to 350 degrees, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so this whole idea that a story has to have 3 acts or 4 acts, or that a story has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. A story has to fulfill the promises that it's made to readers, but it could do that in 1 act. We have 1-act plays. We have 2-act plays. Most comedies and television sitcoms are all 2-act instead of 3. And so a lot of people work backward from this idea of 3 acts, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And my point is, once you understand what lies at the heart of a story, tension, pursuit, desire, escalation, believability, and all of these things, the more that you understand that, the less you'll have to be rooted to a specific template, plot template or story template that you might find online. So I really try to emphasize to people that you have a character we care about who is in a pursuit that matters. And the more that we really climb into that pursuit as readers and as writers, the less we'll have to monkey around with plotting things out and outlining and so on.
Thank you. That's great information. Now, you end your books, but your same character is in many books.
Yeah.
Now, is it a bad idea to end one book with a cliffhanger?
I think that again, you want to fulfill all the promises to the readers. And so typically I do that. And at the end, I usually will have some sort of, you might call it a cliffhanger, but again, it's the promise really of the significance of starting a new story. So I've done a 10-book series, and at the end of most of them, I leave something open for a new storyline that I'll then continue in the next book. But I don't think it should ever be something where readers get to the end of the book and feel disappointed or frustrated or think, now I have to read another book. You don't want that. So instead, I want to wrap everything up in a nice way and then sort of give a little teaser to the next story. I think when people think of cliffhangers, they So let's say that you're writing a story and you say he came to the door and to the basement, he heard sounds and he opened the door. And then you turn the page to the next, chapter and it says, it was his cat or something like that.
Oh,
Well,
that's disappointing.
right. It's disappointing. It's de-escalation. And so people use that gimmick to get people to turn the page, but it doesn't escalate the story. So let's say you were writing it and you say, he came to the edge of the stairs, he heard someone on the stairs, he threw open the door, fired the gun, turned on the light, and saw that it was his daughter. Then
Oh.
you end the chapter, and then he rushes down to help her, whatever it is. So you end the chapters not at a cliffhanger so much, but instead at a revelation, a choice, or a discovery. And so typically when I'm writing at the end of a novel, I'll introduce a storyline that has to do with some intrigue or something that then I can play off with in the next book.
Now, I want to ask you, we only have like 7 minutes left. This has gone by fast. I love your dialogue in your books. How important is dialogue in a suspense mystery? Is dialogue and scene just equally important? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Dialogue comes naturally to me. I think it's because of my background as a storyteller, as a performing storyteller. And so I hear stories play out. And I think in any story that you're writing, in any genre that you write, dialogue, you want it to be authentic. Some people say it should be really boiled down. I don't know that I completely agree with that, because I think you can layer on meaning through having 2 or 3 threads going through a conversation. But especially in a thriller, you don't want it to meander. You want the pace of the story to really move forward. So of course you'll have scenes and you'll have dialogue, and I think either the description, the narrative, or the dialogue can propel the story forward. But again, dialogue in a thriller is going to often be punchy. It'll be used for humor. It'll be used a way to get information to readers, but not long meandering conversations. It probably doesn't work.
Now, when you write, do you visualize your characters and scene as you write? Like, do you see it like as a movie as you're writing?
I kind of do. I tend to write pretty visually, so I hear the characters kind of first, and then as I flesh out the scene, I write it until I can see it, and then I figure out that the scene is pretty much done. So for me, it's really important visually to be able to see what's happening and be able to hear the dialogue, and so I tend to write pretty fast-paced stories with sentence fragments and things like that, and not a lot of long, elaborate paragraphs that just describe places and things like that. I want people to start a book and not put it down. And I'm competing against, and all of us are competing against Facebook, YouTube, a million different video games out there, apps, chats, and everything. We're all competing for the same thing, and that's people's attention. So I look at it like I'm going to use every trick in the book that I know of to keep people engaged in the story and to move it forward fast.
And you definitely do that. Now, I want to ask you, for tools, what kind of tools do you have in your toolbox besides this book? I mean, you have this in your head, but for those of us like me who are learning how to write suspense thrillers, or who have been writing them, what books do you recommend? Not books on thrillers, but the writing the craft.
There is another book that I wrote called Troubleshooting Your Novel that goes through really 80 aspects of novel writing with checklists for each of them. And so that book is really helpful regardless of the genre that you write in. Also recommend On Writing by Stephen King. I feel like that's a good
I love that book.
Yeah, and Donald Moss's book, Writing 21st Century Fiction, is also a good resource. So I think, any one of those would be a good place to start. There are many, many books out there on plot and structure.
I
So
have
my
a few,
goal,
yeah.
yeah, and so my goal is to try and fill the gap that's been left behind, and that is for organic writers, how to write and understand story apart from trying to use templates.
Hmm. I'm a little bit, I guess Jerry B. Jenkins calls it a pantser. You're not a plotter and you're not, you know, you just sort of plan. I have this story in my head and I just write it, but then it takes a twist and a turn sometimes. But I want to ask you, what's your work in progress right now, Stephen? Do you have a work in progress?
Well, I just sent in my latest Patrick Bowers novel. It'll be out, it'll release in the summer of 2018. And so while that's at the editor, I've been playing with a brand new idea. And I can't tell you too much about it, but I will say it's like nothing I've ever written before. It's sort of a literary science fiction novel, standalone. So really excited about it, and we'll see where it goes. We'll see.
You said it was a standalone book. It won't be a series?
I don't know. I don't think so, but you never know. You know, again,
You never know. You never know.
I don't know where exactly it'll end, but it's intriguing to me so far.
I can't believe the time has gone by so fast. I want you to tell us a little bit about your website, and also you teach stories. It's called the Story Blender. Is it like the storyblender.com?
Yes, we have a site called thestoryblender.com, and I interview leading storytellers, authors, screenwriters, and so on the secrets to great storytelling. And the podcasts are free. You can go to the website and listen to the archives. We have maybe 50 or probably 55 different interviews on there, and you can go click on, listen to them, and we do another one every 2 weeks. So thestoryblender.com, and for information about my writing, you can go to stephenjames.net.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Is there any parting words you want to give the listeners before you sign off?
I would say the best piece of advice that someone ever gave to me was, don't fall in love with your first draft. So let me reemphasize that one more time and say, put the effort in, write worthy stories. And I have a sign up in my office that says Rage Against Mediocrity. So I feel like that's sort of my goal when I write, is to really write the best possible story I can, the most worthy book that I can. And I guess I would encourage readers to do, or your listeners to do the same. Rage Against Mediocrity.
Thank you so much. Join us next week for Genre Chat. I'm Sherry Lynn Bisbano.